You know, if you take a stick right now and you just draw a line in the dirt, a massive psychological shift happens almost immediately.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Think about it. Before you drew that line, you were just looking at a patch of ground. It was just like neutral territory.
Right, just dirt.
Yeah. But the literal second you carve that physical boundary into the earth, you create an inside and an outside. You instantly create mine and yours.
Yeah.
You create a zone of safety and a zone of exclusion. And today we're looking at two ancient Greek words that do precisely that on a massive cosmic scale.
And they completely redefine how we understand who gets to draw those lines in our own lives, in our salvation and in all of human history.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We are doing a deep dive today into two massive concepts from the original biblical Greek lexicons, the verb ἀφορίζω and the noun oros.
Yeah, so our mission for this deep dive is to see how these ancient words, one meaning to set a boundary or separate, and the other meaning a towering mountain, reveal this staggering picture of God's sovereignty.
His divine decrees and his absolute authority over earthly kingdoms.
Right, exactly.
Wait, I should not say exactly. I mean, precisely. We're going to look directly at you, the listener, and ask you to consider the sheer scale of these concepts.
We are setting the stage for a really intense theological and historical analysis, one that aligns perfectly with the Reformed understanding of a God who actively calls his people and reigns supreme over creation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should probably start with that line in the dirt, the Greek word ἀφορίζω.
That is a great place to start.
Break down where this word actually comes from, like what it meant to the ancient mind before it ever even hit the pages of the New Testament.
Yeah, so the structure of the word is quite literal, and it gives us a brilliant visual. It is built from two distinct parts.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the preposition āpo, which just means away from.
Right.
And second, you have the verb ἀφορίζω, which means to set a boundary or a limit.
Oh, wait. Aphorizō, that sounds really familiar.
Yeah, if you listen closely to that second part, ἀφορίζω, you can actually hear the root of the English word horizon.
Oh, wow. Yeah, of course.
When you stand outside and look off into the distance, the horizon is the ultimate visual boundary line. It is that visual limit where the earth meets the sky, and it dictates, how far human perception can actually go.
Right. You cannot see past it.
Precisely. So literally, ἀφορίζω means to mark off or to set apart, as if you are drawing a definitive line or boundary.
That makes total sense.
Now, if we look at classical antiquity, ancient Greek writers use this term in very tangible, physical ways.
How so?
Well, in the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures, the word ἀφορίζω frequently translates the Hebrew word migrash.
Migrash. Okay, what is that?
To understand migrash, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of an ancient citizen. That Hebrew term referred to the pastureland or the outskirts immediately surrounding a walled city.
Oh, okay, so like the suburbs.
Sort of, but with much higher stakes. In the ancient world, the city wall was your absolute only defense against, invading armies, bandits, wild animals.
Right, it was dangerous out there.
Very dangerous. The migrash was the physical boundary zone. It was the designated pasture land that separated the absolute safety of the city walls from the untamed, dangerous chaos of the wilderness. It was the buffer zone.
So crossing that line was not just a casual afternoon stroll.
Not at all.
You are leaving the jurisdiction of safety and stepping right into vulnerability.
Yeah, you are on your own at that point.
And that physical sense of property and boundaries, it carries over into the secular Greek writers too, right?
It is, yeah.
You see ancient writers like Demosthenes and Sophocles and Euripides using ἀφορίζω in their texts, but they often apply it to legal or social boundaries, not just dirt and stones.
Right. They used it in a very specific legal context.
Yeah, they used it to describe the legal appropriation of property, like drawing a line and saying, this land is mine legally and you have no claim to it. Even more severely, they used it to describe banishment.
Oh, like ostracism in Athens.
Yeah, precisely. In ancient Athens, they had the practice of ostracism, where citizens would vote to literally expel someone from the city-state for 10 years.
Wow.
They were executing an ἀφορίζω.
Huh?
You were drawing a legal and social line, placing a specific person on the outside of it, and saying you are cut off from the community.
And that concept of being cut off, that introduces the first major biblical usage of the word,
Right.
which deals entirely with exclusion or isolation. We see a negative boundary being drawn here.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. For instance, in Luke 6:22, Jesus uses this exact word when he says, Blessed are you when men hate you and when they exclude you.
He's talking about excommunication there.
Yeah, the trauma excommunication. For a first-century Jewish person, being forced outside the synagogue was not like deciding to attend a different church down the street today.
Right, it was not just a preference thing.
No, it was social and economic death. You were completely isolated.
The religious authorities in that context are weaponizing the boundary line.
Absolutely weaponizing it.
They are drawing a line and placing the followers of Christ on the outside of it to preserve their own theological, well, their own authority structure.
Yeah, to keep control.
But what is fascinating is that we see the Apostle Paul doing something structurally similar, yet he is taking the initiative himself for an entirely different reason.
Right, in Acts 19.
Yeah, in Acts 19.9, Paul is preaching in the synagogue in Ephesus. And over time, a faction within the synagogue becomes really hardened and disobedient.
They were actively speaking evil of the Christian way right in front of the congregation.
Yeah, and the text says Paul departed from them and separated the disciples. He executed a calculated Aphorizō.
He physically removed his people from the antagonistic party.
He did this to eliminate contact and prevent that corrupting, hardened influence from damaging the new believers.
He drew a protective boundary, pulling his people out of the line of fire.
I want to push back on the motivation behind drawing these lines, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because humans are flawed, we sometimes draw these lines out of fear rather than faithfulness. And it seems like even the apostles were not immune to this.
That's a very fair point.
Look at Galatians 2.12. Paul is recounting that infamous incident in Antioch involving Peter.
Oh, yeah. The dietary issue.
Right. Initially, Peter was happily eating with the Gentile believers, just enjoying the freedom of the gospel that says all those dietary and ethnic divisions are abolished in Christ.
He was crossing the old boundary.
Yeah, but then when certain influential men from James arrived from Jerusalem, men who were associated with the strict circumcision party, the text says Peter shrank back and separated himself.
He engaged in an Aphorizō.
He did. Now, Peter's the guy who walked on water.
Yeah.
He preached the sermon at Pentecost. Why does he suddenly draw an artificial, hypocritical line between himself and the Gentiles?
He did it purely out of fear of human opinion.
Right. He created an illegitimate boundary to protect his own reputation among the religious elite.
The psychology behind Peter's action right there is incredibly revealing, actually.
How so?
Well, Peter used the boundary line to isolate himself out of cowardice. He was effectively rebuilding a wall of division that Christ's crucifixion had already demolished.
Oh, that is a great way to put it.
It demonstrates really clearly that human beings frequently use separation as a weapon. We use it for prejudice, tribalism, or just social self-preservation.
We constantly draw lines to protect our own status.
Right, to define who is in and who is out based on our own, arbitrary standards.
But the biblical text draws a really sharp contrast here.
It does.
When human beings draw lines, it is often tainted by sin, or fear, or pride. But when God draws a line, it is always executed with perfect righteousness, perfect justice, and perfect purpose.
God's boundaries are never arbitrary, and they are never driven by anxiety.
Think of God's use of Aphorizō like installing a highly sophisticated secure firewall on a computer network.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, firewall's entire function is to ruthlessly examine incoming traffic. It does not negotiate.
It just acts.
Right. It looks at the data packets and says, you are allowed in, but you over there are completely blocked. It is engineered to keep certain elements completely isolated from the core system. But here's the question for the listener right now. Is this divine isolation always meant as a punishment? Or is it sometimes designed for protection?
That is the crux of it, really.
When we analyze the biblical data, we actually see both realities operating simultaneously. The boundary keeps the malicious code out, which punishes the attacker.
Right.
But it also preserves the integrity of the network, which protects the inhabitants inside.
The firewall analogy captures the mechanical reality perfectly.
Thanks.
And the ultimate cosmic firewall is detailed explicitly in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically regarding the final judgment.
Oh, yes.
In Matthew 13.49, Jesus is explaining the parable of the net. And he says that at the end of the age, the angels will come out and separate, and there's the word Aphorizō, separate the evil from the righteous. Even more vividly, in Matthew 25.32, Jesus describes the day of the Lord. He says all nations across all of human history will be gathered before his throne.
Every single person.
Everyone. And he, acting as the ultimate shepherd, will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats.
That is an intense image.
It is an exclusive, unchallengeable exercise of divine authority. Christ alone possesses the right to draw that final, eternal line.
The righteous inherit the kingdom prepared for them, and the wicked are banished to eternal punishment.
Yeah, human beings do not get a vote in where that line is drawn.
And, this connects so intensely with the Westminster Confession's view of the final judgment and God's righteous decrees.
It really does.
For the listener who might not be totally familiar with that specific terminology, the Confession teaches that God has appointed a definitive day wherein he will judge the world in righteousness by Jesus Christ. That final Aphorizō, that final division between the sheep and the goats, it is not God making a last-minute decision based on how things just happen to pan out.
No, not at all.
It is the culmination of God's sovereign justice. The line he draws on that day is absolute, it is eternal, and it is perfectly just.
Right.
It is the final, public, physical manifestation of his eternal decree. But to truly understand Reformed theology, we have to look past the final day and look at the beginning.
Yeah, you are touching on the core distinction there. The final judgment is the culmination. It is the public execution of the boundary.
Right.
But the mechanism of God setting people apart begins long, long before that day. Which brings us to the second, and frankly, far more joyous biblical usage of aphorizō.
The positive boundary.
Yes, a positive boundary. This is the scenario where someone is separated not for exclusion or punishment, but rather they are selected out of a broader group for a specific divine purpose.
Like being drafted for a special mission.
Exactly. We see a clear example of this in Acts 13.2. The prophets and teachers are gathered, they are worshiping and fasting in the church at Antioch, and the Holy Spirit speaks directly to them.
What does he say?
He says, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them."
Set apart. Aphorizō.
Yes. The Holy Spirit is initiating the aphorizō. He is drawing a circle around these two specific men and saying, these two belong exclusively to my mission now.
And Paul internalizes this reality completely. I mean, it becomes his core identity.
Oh, absolutely.
When he sits down to write the letter to the Romans, which is his magnum opus of theology, the very first verse, Romans 1.1, introduces himself as a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. He recognizes that his entire existence, his career, his suffering, his preaching, it is all defined by this divine boundary line.
He has been fenced in by God for the singular purpose of preaching the gospel.
Right. But if we want to see the absolute bedrock of Reformed theology regarding this concept, we cannot just stop at Paul being set apart for ministry as an adult.
No, we have to go deeper.
We have to look at Galatians 1.19. In this verse, Paul makes a statement that completely shatters any modern idea of human merit or free will decisionism or what theologians call synergistic cooperation.
It is a staggering verse.
Let's break down why that verse is so devastating to human pride.
Well, the text is devastating to human pride because Paul writes that God set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace.
From his mother's womb.
Right. Let's analyze the timeline of that statement. If we connect this to the broader framework of Reformed doctrine, this verse is the pure essence of sovereign election and effectual calling. God executed the aphorizō. He drew the definitive boundary line around the Apostle Paul before Paul had done a single good or bad deed.
Before he could do anything.
Right. He drew the line before Paul had any cognitive ability to formulate a thought, let alone choose or reject God.
Wow.
While he was still a developing infant in the womb, God drew a line around him and decreed, "This one is entirely mine."
That is math.
It is. And it completely refutes the popular notion that God simply looks down the corridors of time, sees who will eventually choose him using their own free will, and then reacts by choosing them back.
Right, because that would make God's choice dependent on human action.
Precisely. Instead, the biblical separation is an act of sovereign grace, occurring entirely by God's unilateral decree.
Let me stop you there, though, and play devil's advocate for the listener who might be struggling with this right now.
Sure, go ahead.
Because to a modern ear, heavily influenced by Western individualism, this sounds incredibly deterministic.
It can sound that way, yes.
It sounds robotic. If God drew the line before Paul was even born, where does human choice factor in? If salvation is not a 50-50 group project where God provides the opportunity and we provide the faith, which is what you meant by synergistic cooperation earlier,
Right.
how do we process this without feeling like we're just pawns on a chessboard?
That is probably the most common and understandable objection to Reformed theology. The difference lies in understanding the nature of our condition before God draws that line.
Okay. Explain that condition.
Well, the biblical reality is not that there are neutral people desperately trying to choose God, but being blocked by a boundary.
Right, we are not innocent bystanders.
No. The reality, as Paul lays out in Ephesians 2, is that humans are spiritually dead in trespasses and sins.
Dead. Not sick, dead.
Exactly. A corpse does not cooperate in its own resurrection. It just cannot. Therefore, if salvation required synergistic cooperation, if it relied even 1% on our inherently flawed, rebellious will, no one would ever be saved.
That makes a lot of sense.
The fact that God unilaterally draws the boundary line, the Aphorizō, is the absolute only reason anyone is saved.
Wow.
It is not cold fatalism. It is a desperate rescue mission orchestrated by a loving creator who reaches into the graveyard of humanity and actively pulls his sheep across the boundary into life. The choice is real, but God's grace is what changes our heart so that we willingly and joyfully choose him.
So applying this to the listener right now, this shifts everything about how you view your faith.
It changes everything.
It means your salvation is not the fragile result of you successfully crossing a boundary line to get to God based on your own intellect or your own morality.
No.
It's the rock-solid result of God drawing a boundary line around you to protect you, claim you, and set you apart for his glory. Aphorizō demonstrates God's absolute sovereignty over humanity. He owns the pen, and he has the absolute right to draw the lines.
Yes.
And this conceptual reality leads perfectly into how God demonstrates that exact same absolute, unquestionable authority over the physical earth.
Right, moving from the conceptual to the physical.
Specifically through its most imposing, intimidating, massive features, the mountains.
The mountains.
The Greek word oros. We are moving from the invisible lines drawn in eternity to the massive walls of rock thrusting out of the dirt.
Yeah, and moving from the conceptual boundary to the massive physical boundary requires us to shift our modern perspective a bit.
How so?
The noun oros refers to a mountain or a hill, but to understand the biblical usage, we first have to really understand the mind of an ancient person.
Okay.
In antiquity, the sheer scale of mountains demanded religious awe. Today, we live in a world of airplanes and drones and steel skyscrapers, so our perspective on height is, well, it is artificially altered.
Right, a mountain is just a scenic backdrop for a vacation photo now.
Exactly. But for an ancient person walking on foot, a mountain was the most dominant, permanent, unmovable object in their entire reality.
It was everything.
It dictated the weather, it blocked travel, it hid enemies. Facing a mountain provoked a deep, visceral, psychological divide.
Right, there is an intense psychological reaction to standing at the base of a 3,000-foot wall of rock when you only have sandals on your feet.
It makes you feel very small.
You realize very quickly how small and temporary you are. So how did this physical intimidation translate into their religious beliefs?
Well, the physical reality created a conceptual religious divide. Ancient people universally separated the mountain into two distinct psychological zones.
What were the zones?
The peak of the mountain, which soared up into the light and was often hidden by clouds, was associated with heaven. Higher consciousness, the day, and the pure upper world of the divine.
Okay, that is the top.
But the inside of the mountain, the deep caverns or the dense, dark, nocturnal forests covering its lower slopes, that was associated with the underworld, death, and the dangerous unconscious.
Oh, wow.
The concepts of above and below were not just spatial directions, they were fundamentally opposed religious symbols.
Let's look at how the surrounding pagan cultures processed this terror and awe based on our sources.
Sure.
If we travel conceptually to ancient Mesopotamia, the region of modern-day Iraq, where you have these vast flat plains, the people there viewed the distant mountains as symbols of absolute security and unyielding might. The Akkadian word shadu literally meant mountain, but it was also used interchangeably to mean refuge or even lord.
Because of the geography.
Right. Because they lived on flat, flood-prone plains, the distant peaks of the Zagros Mountains looked like an impenetrable fortress. They projected their deities right onto these massive geological formations.
And the literature and theology of Mesopotamia is just saturated with this projection.
Give us some examples.
For example, the deity Adad was titled the Lord of the Four Quarters, and his worship was intimately tied to the high places where storms gather.
Okay.
The god Ninib boasted of his terrifying, unstoppable might by claiming in their texts, "The high mountains all flee from me."
Wow, that is intense imagery.
It is. His weapons were described poetically as a mountain whose crushing force none can escape. And then you have Enlil, one of the supreme deities of the Sumerian pantheon, whose very name was eventually transferred to mean Great Mountain.
So the god literally becomes the mountain.
Yes. His primary temple in the city of Nippur was literally known as the Mountain House. For the Babylonians, the distant mountains that encircled their known world were terrifying, remote, and divine.
And the Babylonians built an entire elaborate cosmology around this geographical reality.
It really did.
They believed in twin peak mountains sitting at the extreme eastern and western edges of the world, acting as literal pillars, holding up the physical arch of the sky.
Like massive columns.
Yeah. In the east was the Kamarduku, the bright mountain. This was the place where the sun rose every morning, bringing light and warmth. And they believed this was where the gods met on New Year's Day to fix the destinies of mankind for the coming year.
But the West was very different.
Very different. In the west was Mount Mashu. That was where the sun set. Think about the ancient terror of the sun disappearing behind a dark ridge.
That would be terrifying before electricity.
Mount Mashu was the boundary where heaven met the underworld, marking the terrifying entrance to the realm of the dead.
The Babylonian connection between the Western Mountain and the realm of the dead provides a stark contrast to how the ancient Greeks viewed their mountains, though.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the topography dictates the theology. Greece is a land heavily dominated by forested peaks and rugged terrain. The Greeks lived among the mountains, not far away from them on a flat plain.
Right, they were right in the middle of them.
Therefore, they did not reflexively associate the mountain with the underworld or death. Instead, they looked at Mount Olympus, soaring up into the pure ether and fire of what they considered the divine realm.
And they saw it as the ultimate pristine home of the gods.
Yes. The mountains were the untouched realms of nymphs and muses. Olympus was the symbol of natural perfection, completely disconnected from the dark, subterranean, death-focused judgments of the Babylonian Mashu.
And if you move geographically over to Asia Minor, you find something completely different again.
Right.
You find the widespread worship of Sibyl, known throughout the ancient world as the Mountain Mother.
Oh, yeah.
Her followers did not look up at the sunny, peaceful peaks like the Greeks did. They focused on the dark, chaotic, terrifying side of the mountain.
It was a very different kind of worship.
Yeah, her worship involved ecstatic, frenzied night, dancing through the dark mountain forests. And she was heavily associated with deep, cavernous mountain caves. It was a religion based on the raw, untamed, chaotic forces of nature. To put this in perspective for the modern listener, contrast a quiet, orderly Sunday morning church service with an ancient, torchlit rave inside a mountain cave, driven by the fear of chaotic nature gods.
It was a completely different psychological universe.
Totally different.
Furthermore, moving down into Syria, right on the northern border of Israel's consciousness, we have the archaeological discoveries of the Rosh Shamra texts from the ancient city of Ugarit.
What do those texts reveal?
They reveal the intense worship of Mount Safan, a literal physical peak north of Rosh Shamra, which the Canaanites believed was the literal throne of their storm god Baal.
Okay, Bill, we see him in the Bible a lot.
Right. They believed the entire pantheon of gods assembled on Mount Lel, and that the physical entrance to the underworld was located among these specific peaks. What makes this highly relevant for our biblical analysis is that the Hebrew word for the compass direction north is Saphon.
Really?
Yeah. This strongly links to the ancient Near Eastern cultural idea of a divine, threatening northern peak where the gods supposedly met and plotted.
Okay, here is a massive question that arises from looking at all of this historical data.
Okay, lay it on me.
If the Israelites were completely surrounded by all these cultures, the Babylonians to the east, the Greeks to the west, the Syrians to the north, the people of Asia Minor.
Right, surrounded on all sides.
Cultures that practically worship the dirt and stone of the mountains themselves. How did the biblical writers talk about mountains without falling into the exact same pagan traps?
That's a great question.
How did a Hebrew farmer look up at Mount Hermon and not instinctively invent a localized mountain god like his Canaanite neighbor did?
That is the pivotal question. And the answer showcases the unique divine origin of the Old Testament perspective. The biblical writers completely and utterly subjugated the physical mountains to the absolute sovereignty of Yahweh.
They did not worship them at all.
No, they aggressively stripped the mountain of its pagan mythological status. Israel, instructed by divine revelation, knew that God was not a product of the mountain. God was the sovereign creator of the mountain.
Right.
But before we look at the theology of that, we really have to look at the physical reality of Palestine that influenced their writing.
Let's analyze that physical reality based on our sources.
Okay.
The mountains of Palestine were generally around 3,000 feet tall. By the later periods of Israel's history, they were mostly denuded of trees due to logging and agriculture.
Mm-hmm. They were bare.
Yeah, they were highly practical places.
Yeah.
Psalm 147 mentions them being used for grazing pasture. Isaiah 13.2 talks about lighting massive signal beacons on the bare hills to communicate military threats across the land.
So they used them for communication.
They did. They offered wide, strategic views of the surrounding territory. But make no mistake, they were also incredibly lonely, dangerous places filled with predators and bandits.
Very risky to be out there alone.
To die and lie unburied in the lonely mountains was considered a supreme disgrace for an Israelite.
And yet, despite their massive physical presence and the very real physical dangers they posed, the Old Testament writers constantly use them to showcase God's absolute supremacy.
Right.
To the human eye, the mountains are the oldest, highest, and most solid things on earth. But before Yahweh, they are structurally nothing.
Nothing at all.
Isaiah 40.1 provides a stunning image. It says, God weighs the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance, like a merchant weighing a few grains of sand.
That is massive.
Nahum 1.5 declares that the mountains physically tremble before him. Micah 1.4 gives the vivid, almost apocalyptic image of the mountains melting like wax under the feet of the Lord. And Isaiah 41.15 says God makes Israel a threshing sledge to grind the mountains into dust. God is entirely outside of nature, exercising total violent command over its most imposing features.
The theological shift here from the surrounding cultures is stunning.
It is night and day.
In Canaanite culture, the high place, the Bama, was the supreme cultic site. They believed elevation brought you physically closer to the deity.
Right.
And initially, Israel fell into this trap, utilizing high places like Gibeon for sacrifices. But eventually, God completely rejects the localized pagan high places in favor of specific historical places of revelation. He deliberately chooses Mount Sinai and Mount Zion.
The distinction between a pagan high place and Zion is vital. Sinai and Zion are not inherently magical or mythical mountains like Olympus or Zaphon.
No, they were just hills.
Right. There's nothing geologically special about the dirt in Jerusalem. They are significant purely because the God of history sovereignly chose to reveal himself there in space and time. We see the definitive historical proof that Yahweh is not a localized mountain deity in 1 Kings chapter 20.
Oh, the story with the Arameans.
Yes. The Aramean army attacks Israel, and they mistakenly assume, based on their pagan worldview, that Israel's God is merely, well, just a god of the hills.
Right.
So their military strategy is to draw Israel down and fight them in the flat plains, assuming Yahweh will have no jurisdiction there.
That was a huge mistake.
A massive mistake. God is highly offended by this pagan limitation on his sovereignty. He speaks through a prophet and delivers the massive Aramean army into Israel's hands, specifically to prove that his jurisdiction covers the plains, the valleys, and every single inch of creation.
He cannot be contained by geography.
Because God has so thoroughly subjugated the literal physical mountains, the biblical prophets naturally begin to use mountains as massive metaphors for political empires and earthly rulers.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
The physical height, the unyielding rock, and the sheer intimidation of a mountain became the perfect literary symbol for a stubborn, arrogant human empire.
Can you give a specific example of that?
Sure. In Jeremiah 51.25, God directly addresses the massive, world-dominating empire of Babylon and calls it a destructive mountain. He promises to roll Babylon off the cliffs and make it a burnt mountain.
Wow.
And in Zechariah 4.7, the prophet looks at the massive political and logistical obstacles facing the rebuilding of the temple and says, "Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you shall become a plain."
God looks at human authority, no matter how entrenched, and flattens it.
The most breathtaking example of this metaphorical use, and the one that really sets the stage for the New Testament, is found in Daniel chapter 2.
Oh, the statue dream.
Yes. King Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a terrifying, massive metallic statue representing the successive human empires of history: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome.
Right.
Then, in the dream, a stone cut out by no human hand strikes the statue on its feet, crushing the entire history of human empire to powder. And that stone, representing the kingdom of God, grows into a great mountain that fills the whole earth. It is the ultimate, eternal authority displacing every single earthly kingdom. It is God establishing a mountain that can never be shaken.
We even see this deeply ingrained metaphorical language bleeding into the writings of the rabbis and the pseudepigrapha during the intertestamental period.
Really? Like, where?
Well, the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Sukkah 52a, compares the internal evil impulse of a human being to a great mountain that the righteous must somehow overcome.
Interesting.
Yeah, in the book of Enoch, the fallen angels who rebelled against God are described as burning mountains of iron and gold. So whether the writer is describing an external world-dominating empire or an internal, deeply rooted sin, the mountain consistently represents an imposing, seemingly unbeatable force standing in opposition to God.
Having analyzed that the Old Testament views mountains not as deities, but as created objects entirely subject to God, and metaphorically as earthly authorities that God will judge and dismantle, we can logically follow this concept right into the New Testament.
Yes, let's go there.
We need to look at how Jesus Christ, God incarnate, interacts with the physical hills of Judea, and how that interaction ultimately signals the end of all earthly dominion.
Looking at the physical reality of mountains in the Gospels, they maintain that Old Testament sense of danger, isolation, and ruggedness.
They do not suddenly become safe?
No. We know historically from sources outside the Bible about the flight of the early Christians to the mountains in Pella around 66 AD when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman legion.
Right, they fled to the mountains for physical survival.
In Mark chapter 5, we meet the terrifying demoniac who lives among the tombs and the desolate hills, completely isolated from human society, howling in the night. And in Matthew 18:12, Jesus tells the famous parable of the shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep in the mountains to go search for the one that is lost.
That is a famous one.
Right, but to a modern reader, leaving sheep in the mountains sounds scenic. To a first-century shepherd, it implies leaving them in a place of extreme vulnerability, rugged terrain, and lurking predators. The mountain is not safe.
The gospel writers frequently use a specific Greek phrase, eis to oros, meaning he went up into the mountains.
Okay.
It is crucial to note how Jesus uses the terrain. He is rarely depicted standing on an isolated, pointy peak, meditating like some Eastern guru.
Right. He is not just seeking a scenic view.
No. He goes into the hills for specific functional reasons. He goes to seek extreme solitude. He goes to pray away from the crushing, exhausting demands of the multitudes who just wanted miracles and free food. And significantly, he goes into the difficult, elevated terrain to force the crowds to decide whether they are truly willing to expend the physical effort to follow him and hear his teaching.
Well, like a test.
Yeah, think about the Sermon on the Mount. The elevation requires a deliberate, physical choice from the followers. You have to sweat to hear the sermon.
Wow, yeah.
He uses the mountain as a physical filter to separate the passive consumers from the active disciples.
The Transfiguration is perhaps the most famous and doctrinally significant mountain scene in the entire New Testament.
Absolutely.
While ancient church tradition claims it happened on Mount Tabor, the gospel writers themselves do not seem to care at all about the specific name of the mountain.
No, they do not mention it.
They only care that it was a high mountain. The specific geographic name is irrelevant to their theology.
Right.
The physical elevation was meant to bring the disciples' thoughts closer to God's world, stripping away the distractions, the noise, the religious debates, and the faithlessness of the valleys below. It was a place of clear, unobstructed, terrifying divine revelation, where the veil of Christ's humanity was briefly pulled back.
We see a contrasting dark use of the mountain concept in the account of the Mount of Temptation in Matthew chapter 4, though. The devil takes Jesus to a very high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory in a single moment. Geographically and physically speaking, there is no physical mountain anywhere in Judea, or the world for that matter, high enough to literally see all the kingdoms of the earth.
No, that is impossible.
This was a supernatural, spiritual vision, utilizing the ancient concept of the mountain as a place to survey the totality of earthly dominion.
Wow.
Satan is offering Jesus the authority over all the metaphorical mountains of human empire. He is offering the crown of global rule without the suffering of the cross.
Which brings us to the breathtaking climax of the entire biblical narrative in the book of Revelation.
Yes, the end of it all.
This is where we bring our two Greek words, Aphorizō, the drawing of a sovereign boundary line of separation, and oros, the towering mountain of human authority and pride, together into a single, unified theological vision of the end of the world.
The apocalyptic symbols in Revelation are staggering in their scope.
They really are.
In Revelation 8.8, the Apostle John sees a great mountain burning with fire cast violently into the sea. In Revelation 6.12, and again during the bowl judgments in 16.20, we see the earth convulsing so violently that every mountain and island flees away and completely disappears.
Completely gone.
To understand the gravity of this, we have to decode the symbols using the Old Testament cipher we just discussed.
Right.
In the prophetic literature, islands frequently represented the distant Gentile nations living in false security far away across the sea.
Okay.
And mountains, as we established from Daniel and Jeremiah, represented entrenched human political authority and arrogant earthly empires.
So when the text says the mountains and islands flee away from the presence of God, it is not just talking about a massive geological earthquake.
No, it's much bigger than that.
It is saying that every false human security, every arrogant political structure, every corrupt government, and every earthly empire is completely obliterated before the throne of God.
They have nowhere to hide.
We see this confirmed explicitly in Revelation 17.9, which talks about the terrifying beast with 7 heads, and the text explicitly states that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Historically, this is a clear reference to the 7 hills of Rome, the seat of the empire persecuting the early church.
Yes, the immediate historical context is Rome.
Right.
But because 7 is the consistent biblical number of completeness and totality, those 7 hills represent far more than just the physical geography of the capital city of the Roman Empire.
What do they represent?
They represent the absolute totality of world empires across all of human history, upon which the seductive, worldly, rebellious system of Babylon sits.
Wow.
It is the complete summation of human rebellion against God's authority, concentrated into the metaphor of the ultimate, unscalable mountain range.
This leads us to a staggering theological conclusion that ties this entire deep dive together.
Yeah, it all comes together here.
Think about the physical return of Christ. When he returns to execute the final judgment, when he initiates the ultimate eternal Aphorizō, separating the sheep from the goats with a single word, what happens to the physical and political stage upon which human rebellion played out for thousands of years?
It is gone.
Every single earthly mountain and island, representing every human empire, every billionaire's corporation, every corrupt politician, and every false authority, completely melts away into nothingness.
The boundaries of human pride are permanently erased by the righteous decree of the Creator. And we have to ask, what replaces that fractured, mountain-filled landscape?
Good question.
In the description of the New Jerusalem detailed in Revelation 21 and 22, there is a fascinating deliberate omission by the Apostle John.
What is missing?
There is no Temple Mountain at all.
Wow.
The entire ancient, pagan, and even Old Testament concept of needing a localized high place to reach up to God is gone. It vanishes because the separation is fundamentally over.
The Aphorizō is done.
Yes. God dwells directly, physically, and intimately with his people on a renewed earth. The imposing barriers, the unscalable cliffs, and the rigid boundaries are removed forever.
We have covered an incredible scope of material today. Think about where we started.
A line in the dirt.
Right. What begins as a simple thought experiment about a line drawn in the dirt, the Aphorizō, and a physical pile of rocks, the oros, unfolds chronologically through Scripture to reveal the entire framework of Reformed theology.
It is an amazing progression.
We see God's sovereign, unconditional choice to set his people apart from the womb, requiring zero synergistic cooperation from us.
Right.
We see his total, unquestioned dominion over the proudest human empires, crushing them like dust under a threshing sledge. And we see his absolute exclusive right to draw the final boundary line of eternity, separating the righteous from the wicked.
It demands a massive perspective shift from the modern Christian.
It really does.
It forces us to look past the imposing political, social, and economic structures of our current world. It forces us to recognize the invisible yet unbreakable decrees of a sovereign God who commands both the lines we cannot cross and the mountains that cannot stand before him.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final question to mull over as you go about your week, head to work, or watch the evening news. If God's ultimate design for eternity is a reality, where every massive mountain of human authority is completely leveled, and there are no more boundaries keeping you from his presence, how does that shift the way you view the intimidating mountains and dividing lines in your own life today?
That is the question.
Are you terrified of a political outcome, an economic shift, or a medical diagnosis, treating it like an unyielding Babylonian mountain god?
Wow.
When you see the boundary lines drawn in the dirt of your own circumstances, remember who actually holds the pen.